Welcome everybody to the Liturgy of the Chalice. Today we continue the Gospel of Mark, part 24, and we'll cover the first half of chapter 13 today and the second half of chapter 13 next Sunday. So here Jesus prophesies the destruction of the second temple. Mark 13, 1 through 2. As he, Jesus, came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." So here, Mar Yeshua, the Master Jesus, is prophesying or predicting that in a future time, the second temple will be destroyed. And it did come to pass. In 70 AD, the Romans sacked Jerusalem, destroyed Jerusalem, murdered many people, starved thousands more, if not tens of thousands, and they destroyed the second temple. So Jesus prophesied this. If we accept that Jesus was born in 1 AD and that he died in 33 AD, somewhere around there, that would mean that Jesus made this prophecy 38 to 40 years prior to the actual destruction of the second temple. If we think about older prophets, they always said that when there was a lack of faith, there would be destruction in Jerusalem. There would be a dispersion of those who would not keep faith with God. And although Jesus doesn't speak this way, it fits the prophetic tradition. In the last several weeks that we discussed the Gospel of Mark, Jesus was coming to Jerusalem not to speak to his disciples or his followers or his admirers. He was coming to change the hearts of the Pharisees and the Sadducees that ran the second temple. And most of them did not hear him. So earlier he did a prophetic act in which he withered the fig tree. And that was symbolic that Jesus felt that his teachings weren't being heard, that people were not softening their hearts and following the way of the heart rather than the way of the letter. And he prophesied that the priesthood of the second temple would be destroyed at that point in time. And now he's saying that the actual buildings of the temple will be thrown down. Not one stone will be left here upon another. So when will the temple be destroyed? And will this signal the end times? A lot of people probably thought it did. We have to understand that many Jews throughout history had many different ideas. They felt that destruction of their way of life would mean the end of the world. That kind of a thing. The coming of the day of the Lord, which Isaiah prophesied. The day of the Lord in Isaiah's time was his prediction of the first temple being destroyed by the Babylonian Empire and the Jews being taken into exile. Here Jesus is predicting something similar, kind of a day of the Lord, even though he doesn't call it that, but it's the end of the second temple in Jerusalem, because the second temple leadership turned away from his teachings, his prophetic utterances, which he received from the throne of God in his highest form of intuition. Often this next set of verses is taken by modern orthodox Christians to mean that the end of the world was coming. And we'll see now and next week even more clearly that Jesus was not predicting the imminent end of the world. Jesus was not an apocalypticist in the sense of predicting the end of the world and this coming resurrection of bodies physically coming up from the grave. He did not teach that. So Mark 13, 3 through 8, when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him, Jesus, privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he.' And they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place. But the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." So Jesus makes this dramatic revelation to his disciples, who are Jews, who probably at least at one point in their life reverenced the Second Temple and the institutions of the Jewish priesthood. And they're saying, "When, Master? You said that Jerusalem and the Second Temple will be torn down. When?" And Jesus says, "When you hear rumors of war and wars that are happening nearby, this must take place, but the end is still to come." Meaning they're going to start hearing rumors of war happening nearby, but the end is still to come. A lot of people, Orthodox Christians, will interpret this as being that they'll hear of wars, don't be alarmed, I'll protect you from the destruction of Jerusalem, etc., assuming that they're still alive at that point. He said this must take place, but the end is still to come. So many ministers and priests will preach that the destruction of Jerusalem was kind of the beginning of the end of the world. But the end itself, the day of the Lord, and the rising of the physical bodies of the resurrection at the time of the second coming, with Jesus as the proposed Davidic Messiah, that's still to come, meaning sometime in the future. And that's not what Jesus was prophesying. And we'll see it even more clearly next week in the discussion for next week. But to suffice it to say, all prophets prophesied for the people of their time. They prophesied for something that those people hearing Jesus would live to see. Not for people thousands of years later, but yet many apocalypticists throughout the ages since the time of Jesus have predicted some specific day in which the world would end. And it has never ended. The same with St. Paul and all of his epistles. Paul saw the resurrection of Jesus as being the imminent end, cataclysmic end of the world. That everything would end, that Jesus would very soon descend from the clouds in the form of the Davidic Messiah. And this second coming of Jesus would herald the rise of the dead and judgment day, when the good people would go with Jesus and the bad people would go you know where. That has been the theological basis of Orthodox Christianity ever since. But Jesus didn't say that. He said, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed. The end is still to come. So in other words, the war has not come to Jerusalem yet. When they hear of wars and rumors of wars, because the Romans were interspersed within Jerusalem, people were bound to hear something, and when one person hears it, the next one tells the next one, the next one, the next one, and so on and so forth. So when they hear rumors of wars, don't be alarmed, but the end of Jerusalem and the Second Temple is still to come. Other signs that Jesus predicted here were earthquakes and famines. Famines would also, the starvation of the people would also signal the end of the Second Temple and Jerusalem as they knew it. And this did come to pass when Rome came and entered Jerusalem and occupied it. They made it so that nobody can go in or out. So food couldn't go in and out. Water couldn't go in and out. And many people starved to such an extent that Josephus, the great Jewish historian, said that people were eating their babies just to survive. Jesus says that all of this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. This is extremely important to understand. The birth pangs of what? Of Messiah. The birth pangs of Messiah. This meant that the Messiah had not been born yet. Jesus was saying that the end of Jerusalem, the end of the second temple, these earthquakes, wars, and famines, they signaled the birth pangs of the Bar Enosh, the Son of Mankind collective Messiah. Here Jesus distinctly says that the Messiah is different from himself. The beginning of birth pangs means that you're about to go into labor and give birth to something new. In this case, birth to the Messiah. Jesus was already born 30-some years ago, minimally. He was already born. So if Jesus was the one-time Davidic Messiah, that earlier on in Mark he debunked and ridiculed the idea of the Davidic Messiah, thus proclaiming that he did not self-identify as such. If Jesus were the Davidic Messiah, he would have already been born. So this again proves that Jesus did not accept the Davidic Messiah. He said, all these terrible things that I'm prophesying, they are the beginning of the birth pangs, the beginning of the birth of Messiah. Because although terrible things happen in the world, they have happened, they are happening, and they will continue to happen. The friction on humanity makes great people stand up. Socially, politically, spiritually. When terrible things happen in the world, leaders must rise up. And in this sense, Jesus was saying that the friction caused by this destruction would cause people who are spiritually prepared by his halakha to experience the second birth, to be reborn in a very difficult and painful way into the Bar Enosh, into the Son of Mankind Messiah. This rubbing of rocks between individual soul and the difficulties of the times, people, places, and things around us that cause us friction and test our spiritual rigor. That is what evolves us from the old humanity, the first Adam, into the new humanity, the second Adam, which is the Bar Enosh, the Son of Mankind collective Messiah. So here Jesus very distinctly says, I am not the one and only Messiah. Otherwise, there would not need to be any birth pains. He was already there, right? So Jesus is saying that all these terrible things were birth pangs, the labor pangs, creating a new spiritualized humanity, and that this would go on into the future for some time. Jesus predicts the martyrdom of his apostles. Just like Jesus would be crucified for teaching truth, going against the grain, many of Jesus' apostles, most of them were martyred. So Mark 13, 9 through 13, Jesus says, as for yourselves, beware, for they will hand you over to the councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings because of me, as a testimony to them. And the good news, my proclamation, my gospel, must first be proclaimed to all nations. When they bring you to trial and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given you at that time. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father to his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. So Jesus here is predicting that as I will suffer and die, Most of you will. I believe all of them but Mary Magdalene and John the Beloved died of martyrdom. They were murdered. They were executed because they were teaching something that was against the grain. In early Christianity, for a short period of time, early Christians were persecuted by both Jews. Paul was one such Jew that persecuted the Christians. And they were also persecuted by Romans. They called the Christians atheists because the Christians refused to worship and make offerings to the various Roman gods. So Jesus here predicts very difficult times in that many people will be hated and persecuted because they are his disciples, teaching his teachings. But Jesus says the one who endures to the end will be saved. The disciple who endures to the end and does as I teach will be saved, will receive second spiritual birth. And this is true of us today too. Not that we need to be persecuted, thank God, in most places where we find ourselves, but one who endures, who does the teachings of Jesus, who embodies in thought, word, and deed the teachings of the Master Jesus. He or she that does this to the end consciously will be saved. Saved from what? From your own thoughts, words, and deeds that separate you from God. By doing the halakha, we align ourselves with God. We attune ourselves with God. We become consciously one with God. And if you endure and stick with it, no matter the ups and downs of your personal spiritual journey, then you will be saved. You will liberate yourself with the grace of the Master Jesus' teachings. Jesus warns his apostles when to escape Jerusalem. He tells them signs of when it will be before the Roman soldiers actually come into Jerusalem and start sacking it. It's very important that Jesus gave these warnings to his apostles because when Rome came in, as we said earlier, they closed down the whole city. Nobody was going in and out. They were destroying Jerusalem, going house to house and killing people, destroying, taking down every block of the second temple to the ground. And those that were hiding within Jerusalem were being starved to death because nothing was coming in or out of Jerusalem. No food or water could come in. So they starved to death. It was a very horrific time. Jesus says in Mark 13, 14 through 20, but when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the housetop must not go down or enter the house to take anything away. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not be in the winter. For in those days there will be suffering such as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now. No, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he has cut short those days. So here it's very important. When the Romans entered Jerusalem, they entered the temple and they established statues of Roman gods within the temple. And this would be sacrilege to have other gods other than Yahweh worship within the second temple. So when this sacrilege began to happen in the temple, that was a sign to his apostles to quickly leave Jerusalem. Do not look back. Do not go home to get food, clothes, anything. Leave immediately. Because this was the only way that Jesus' teachings would be preserved, is if he instructed his apostles to run away. Don't stay there. Go to the mountains. Go outside of the city precincts, so you won't be captured inside and die at the sword or starve to death. Because Jesus wanted the teachings to be spread far and wide. Jesus said, woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infant in those days, with no food going in and out. both mother and baby starved to death. And as we said, Josephus said that it was so bad that adults ate their newborn children just to survive. Jesus says, pray that it may not be in winter, because winter makes everything even more difficult because it's cold. And in the winter, because it's cold, people get sick. And because they're not eating properly, they're not exercising because they can't move through the streets, it's obvious that immunity would go down. So winter just makes everything worse. By the cold, the increase of bacteria and virus infecting people in cold flu season, which in those days would have been much more dangerous than today when there's medicines and proper vaccinations, etc., etc. Jesus said in those days there was so much suffering due to the murdering, pilgrimage. There was physical suffering, people starving, being murdered, mental and emotional suffering, seeing your family and friends being murdered, raped, pillaged, and spiritual suffering. You see the temple collapsing, the whole center of your life being destroyed. So such suffering was so great that it had never been experienced before, and Jesus proclaimed that it would never be as bad again. And he said that if Yahweh, the Abba, the Father, Mother, God, had not cut short those days of the Roman occupation in Jerusalem in 70 AD, no one would have been saved. All the Jews would have been exterminated. But for the sake of the elect, the chosen one of God, that would follow Torah and Jesus' halakha, whom God chose, he had cut short those days. So God's grace stopped the Romans short of totally exterminating the Jews, so that the Jewish way of life could continue. We'll continue this next week. Let us continue with the Liturgy of the Chalice.